Sarah Martinez's eyes snapped open at 4:47 a.m., 13 minutes before her alarm was set to sound. In the suffocating darkness of her bedroom, she lay perfectly still, her breathing controlled and shallow. Something was wrong. After 8 years, as a Marine Corps Force reconnaissance instructor and 3 tours in Afghanistan, she'd learned to trust the primitive part of her brain that screamed danger when everything else seemed peaceful. The silence was too complete. Rolling out of bed with practiced stealth, Sarah's bare feet made no sound on the cold hardwood floor. She'd inherited her grandfather's ranch house, along with his land, and like him, she'd learned to read the subtle rhythms of the Montana wilderness. At this hour, she should hear the soft hooting of great horned owls, the distant howl of coyotes, and the gentle rustling of wind through the pine trees that surrounded her property. Instead, she heard nothing but the thundering of her own pulse. In her ears, Rex, her German shepherd, was already standing at the bedroom door when she reached for it. The 90-pound dog's ears were pinned forward, his body rigid with alertness. In Afghanistan, Rex had been her partner in countless reconnaissance missions trained to detect IEDs, enemy combatants, and imminent danger. He'd saved her life 7 times that she could count, and probably dozens more that she couldn't. If Rex was worried, she should be terrified. Sarah pulled on her grandfather's old flannel robe and padded silently toward the kitchen. Rex at her heel. The house creaked around them with familiar sounds, the settling of century-old timber, the whisper of wind through gaps in the window frames, the steady tick of her grandfather's antique clock. But underneath these comforting sounds, something felt different. Wrong. At the kitchen window, she peered out at her 500-acre domain. The Martinez Ranch stretched out before her in the pale pre-dawn light, rolling hills covered in winter grass and scattered pine groves. Her grandfather had built this life from nothing, arriving from Mexico in 1952 with $3 in his pocket and a determination to carve out a piece of the American dream. 3 generations later, Sarah was the last Martinez standing, the final guardian of land that had been paid for with blood, sweat, and the kind of stubborn pride that refused to bow to anyone. She made coffee with hands that didn't shake, a skill learned in forward operating bases, where steady nerves meant the difference between life and death. As the ancient percolator began to bubble, Sarah allowed herself to think about the signs she'd been ignoring for weeks. Small things at first, a water trough that had been moved slightly, tire tracks near the back fence that didn't match any of her neighbor's vehicles, the uncomfortable feeling of being watched when she rode her property line. Her nearest neighbor, old Pete Hendricks, lived 5 miles away across rugged terrain. The man was 83 and could barely drive his pickup truck, let alone trespass on her land. The Kowalski family had a spread 8 miles to the north, but they were seasonal residents who'd closed up their place for the winter months ago. That left strangers, and in Sarah's experience, strangers who skulked around isolated ranches in the middle of the night, rarely had good intentions. Steam rose from her coffee mug as Sarah stepped onto her front porch, Rex moving like a shadow beside her. The morning air cut through her flannel robe with knife-edge cold, but she barely noticed. Her attention was focused entirely on the landscape before her, searching for anything out of place. Her eyes had adjusted to low-light conditions years ago in the caves and compounds of Kandahar province, where missing a single detail could mean death for her entire squad. That's when she saw it. Near the tree line, about 200 yards from the house, a section of prairie grass lay flattened, in a way that had nothing to do with weather or wildlife. Someone had been there recently, lying prone and watching her house. Sarah's blood turned to ice water as she recognized the pattern a professional observation post, the kind she'd taught countless Marines to construct for surveillance missions. Rex growled low in his throat, the sound barely audible but loaded with menace. His nose was pointed toward the barn, and Sarah followed his gaze to spot something that made her stomach clench with dread. The barn door, which she always secured with a heavy chain and padlock, stood slightly ajar. Not much, maybe 3 inches, but enough to tell her that someone had been inside her property during the night, moving with the fluid grace that had earned her the nickname, the Ghost, during her military service. Sarah retreated into the house and climbed the stairs to her bedroom. From the closet, she retrieved a black metal case that hadn't been opened in 6 months. Inside, nested in foam padding, lay her grandfather's .3006 hunting rifle, alongside her own military-issued sidearm and night vision scope. The rifle was a thing of beauty, handed down through 3 generations of Martinez men before coming to her. Her grandfather had used it to feed his family during the lean years. Her father had carried it during hunting seasons that put meat on the table when money was tight, and now it fell to Sarah to use it in defense of the land they'd all loved. As she loaded the rifle with practiced efficiency, Sarah's mind shifted into the tactical mode that had kept her alive through 97 combat missions. Whoever was watching her property had made several critical mistakes. They'd assumed she was just another isolated woman, vulnerable and easy to intimidate. They'd underestimated the security measures she'd learned to implement in hostile territory. Most importantly, they had no idea that the woman living alone on this remote ranch was someone who'd been trained by the United States Marine Corps to be a weapon herself. But as Sarah chambered around and clicked off the safety, she couldn't shake the feeling that her unknown watchers were about to make their move. The careful surveillance, the probing of her defenses, the gradual escalation of their boldness, it all pointed to predators who were almost ready to strike. Standing at her bedroom window with the rifle in her hands, Sarah Martinez gazed out at the land her family had died to protect and made a silent promise to her grandfather's memory. Whatever was coming for her in the darkness, it would learn that some targets shoot back, and some ghosts are more dangerous than the living ever imagine. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah first noticed the signs of surveillance, and the psychological warfare was beginning to take its toll. What had started as subtle intrusions had escalated into a campaign of deliberate intimidation that would have broken a lesser person. But Sarah Martinez was not a lesser person, and every calculated move her stalkers made only served to sharpen her tactical awareness. The first escalation came on a Tuesday morning when Sarah discovered her prize bull, Thunder, had been let out of his pen during the night. The massive Angus had wandered 3 miles before she found him, confused and agitated. Someone had cut the wire on his gate with precision tools, leaving no trace except the clean edges of severed metal. It was a message: "We can access your property whenever we want, and we can cost you money." 2 days later, her security cameras military grade. Equipment she'd installed after her first tour in Afghanistan had been systematically repositioned. Not destroyed, which would have been obvious vandalism, but carefully angled away from the key approach routes to her house. Whoever was doing this understood surveillance equipment and knew exactly how to create blind spots. Sarah spent an entire day repositioning the cameras and adding motion sensors, but she knew her unknown adversaries were watching her work, learning her defensive measures. The psychological pressure intensified when Sarah found the first note, tucked under her windshield wiper after a trip to town for supplies. The paper was clean white notebook paper, the kind available at any store, and the message was written in block letters with a standard ballpoint pen. "Pretty lady, shouldn't leave alone. We'll keep you company soon." No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing that could be traced back to its author. But the message was clear. They'd been watching her in town, tracking her movements, and they wanted her to know it. Sheriff's Deputy Tom Rodriguez had become a regular fixture at the Martinez Ranch, his weathered face growing more concerned with each visit. Rodriguez was a 20-year veteran of law enforcement who'd seen every kind of criminal the Montana wilderness could produce. And something about this case had him genuinely worried. "Sarah, I've been doing some research on similar cases," Rodriguez said during his latest visit, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee at her kitchen table. "There's been a crew working the isolated ranches across 3 counties. They call themselves surveyors or land assessors, but they're really casing properties for robbery. Problem is, they've been escalating." Sarah set down her own cup, her dark eyes focused intently on the deputy's face. "What kind of escalation?" Rodriguez pulled out a manila folder thick with police reports and crime scene photographs. "Started in Wyoming 6 months ago. Couple in their 60s, remote cattle ranch about 40 miles from Cheyenne. They came home from visiting their daughter to find their house ransacked, vehicles stolen, livestock scattered. Initially looked like a standard rural burglary until we found evidence suggesting the perpetrators had been watching the property for weeks." The deputy's voice grew heavier as he continued. 2 months later, same pattern in Colorado. Elderly rancher and his wife. This time, the crew didn't just steal. They assaulted the couple and burned down their barn. The husband spent 3 weeks in the hospital. His wife still won't talk about what happened to her during those 6 hours before neighbors found them. Sarah's jaw tightened as she absorbed the implications. "And the most recent incident? 3 weeks ago in Wyoming. Young couple, just like you, living alone on inherited land." Rodriguez's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "We found the husband tied up in his own barn, forced to watch while they while they hurt his wife. Then they executed both of them and made it look like a drug deal gone wrong. If we hadn't found the surveillance evidence cameras repositioned exactly like yours, we never would have connected it to the same crew." The weight of Rodriguez's words settled over the kitchen like a funeral shroud. Sarah had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan, had faced Taliban fighters and improvised explosive devices, but this was different. This was personal, targeted, and happening on the land her grandfather had died to protect. "How many of them are we talking about?" Sarah asked, her tactical mind already processing potential defensive scenarios. "FBI task force thinks it's a 4-man crew. Professional criminals, possibly with military or security backgrounds based on their surveillance techniques. They've been moving in a rough circle through the mountain states, hitting one property every month or 2. Long enough between incidents to avoid establishing a clear pattern, remote enough locations to minimize law enforcement response times." Rodriguez leaned forward, his expression grave. "Sarah, these aren't just thieves anymore. They've graduated to rape and murder, and everything about your situation fits their target profile perfectly. Isolated property, single occupant, valuable assets, and no immediate neighbors to provide assistance." That evening, after Rodriguez had left with promises to increase patrol frequency, Sarah stood in her grandfather's study surrounded by 3 generations of Martinez family history. Awards from his military service in Korea hung beside her father's rodeo trophies and her own Marine Corps commendations. The room was a testament to the fighting spirit that ran in her bloodline, and Sarah drew strength from their legacy. She opened her grandfather's old footlocker, the one he'd brought home from the war, and removed items she hadn't touched in months. Night vision goggles, tactical communication equipment, motion detectors, and tripwires, tools of warfare adapted for home defense. If her stalkers wanted to escalate this conflict, she would accommodate them with the full weight of her military training. As darkness fell over the Montana wilderness, Sarah completed her transformation of the ranch house into a fortress. Every approach route was covered by overlapping fields of observation. Motion sensors created an invisible perimeter that would alert her to any intrusion. Her grandfather's rifle was loaded and positioned for rapid deployment, while her sidearm remained within arm's reach at all times. But as she settled into her observation post in the second-floor window, scanning the tree line through her night vision scope, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her stalkers were already closer than she realized. The absolute silence that had awakened her that morning 3 weeks ago had returned, and Rex was pacing the house with the restless energy of a predator sensing nearby threats. At 11:47 p.m., her motion sensors began to trigger in sequence, detecting movement along the ranch's perimeter. Through her night vision scope, Sarah watched 4 dark figures emerge from the tree line, like wolves emerging from their den. They moved with practiced coordination, communicating through hand signals, approaching her house with the confidence of predators who believed they'd cornered helpless prey. Sarah's finger found the trigger of her grandfather's rifle as she realized her 3 weeks of preparation were about to be tested. The stalkers had finally revealed themselves, and the war for Martinez Ranch was about to begin. Through her night vision scope, Sarah watched the 4 figures materialize from the darkness like demons emerging from hell itself. The leader moved with the swagger of a man who'd never encountered real resistant 6'4" of muscle and malice. Wrapped in military surplus gear, his name was Jake Morrison, though Sarah wouldn't learn that until later. What she could see immediately was the way the other 3 deferred to him, the casual authority in his gestures, and the predatory confidence that marked him as the alpha of this pack of human wolves. Morrison raised his hand, and his crew stopped moving with synchronized precision. Sarah's military training recognized the hand signals they used, modified Army field communications adapted for criminal purposes. These weren't street thugs or desperate addicts looking for quick cash. These were professionals who'd perverted their military skills for evil, and that made them infinitely more dangerous than common criminals. The second man, Antonio "Tony the Snake" Reeves, moved to the left with the fluid grace of someone comfortable with violence. Even through the night vision scope, Sarah could see the prison tattoos covering his arms like a roadmap of brutality. Tony's file, which she'd read in Deputy Rodriguez's reports, detailed a career of escalating violence that had started with petty theft in his teens and evolved into armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, and suspected involvement in 3 unsolved murders across 2 states. Miguel Santos took the right flank, and Sarah's blood chilled as she recognized his movement pattern. Military training, probably special forces, with the kind of tactical awareness that came from real combat. Experience. Santos had been an Army Ranger before a dishonorable discharge for assaulting a fellow soldier landed him in military prison. After his release, he drifted into the criminal underworld where his skills made him valuable to men like Morrison. The 4th member of their crew hung back near the tree line, Danny Kruger, 22 years old, and desperately trying to prove himself worthy of running with killers. Danny's youth made him unpredictable, and Sarah knew from experience that scared young men with guns were often more dangerous than seasoned professionals because they acted on emotion rather than calculation. Morrison gestured toward the house, and Sarah watched her property transform into a battlefield through the green glow of her night vision equipment. The crew began their approach with textbook military precision, using available cover and maintaining overlapping fields of fire. If she'd been an ordinary rancher, untrained in combat tactics, she would have been dead within minutes of their arrival. But Sarah Martinez was anything but ordinary. Her finger caressed the trigger of her grandfather's rifle as she tracked Morrison through her scope. At 200 yards, with no wind and perfect visibility through her night vision equipment, it would be an easy shot. One squeeze of the trigger and the crew's leader would be eliminated, likely causing the others to retreat in confusion and fear. Yet something held her back. Perhaps it was the naive hope that confronted with armed resistance, they might simply leave. Perhaps it was her military training about rules of engagement and proportional response. Or perhaps it was the voice of her grandfather, who'd always taught her that taking a life was a decision that could never be undone, even when that life belonged to someone who deserved to die. It was a moment of hesitation that would nearly cost her everything. Morrison kicked in her front door with casual violence, the sound of splintering wood echoing across the ranch like a gunshot. Sarah watched through her scope as her grandfather's handcrafted furniture was overturned. Family photographs scattered across the floor, and 3 generations of Martinez family history destroyed by animals who respected nothing and no one. The sound of shattering glass drew her attention to the living room window, where Tony, the snake, was climbing through with a crowbar in his hand. Sarah's grandmother's china cabinet, the one piece her grandfather had managed to bring from Mexico in 1952, exploded into fragments as Tony swept everything onto the floor with savage glee. Miguel Santos emerged from the kitchen holding her grandfather's military medals, a bronze star and purple heart that represented courage and sacrifice these criminals could never understand. Santos examined the medals with mocking interest, before dropping them carelessly into his equipment bag, treating sacred family history like common loot to be fenced later. That's when Sarah saw Morrison emerge from the house, carrying her grandmother's jewelry box, the carved wooden treasure that contained not valuables, but memories. Her mother's wedding ring, her grandmother's rosary, photographs of family members who died before she was born. Morrison held the box like a trophy, his scarred face twisted in a grin that promised horrors yet to come. Sarah's military training screamed at her to take the shot, but civilian conditioning held her back. These were American citizens on American soil, and despite their crimes, she couldn't bring herself to execute them without giving them a chance to surrender. It was a moment of mercy that would haunt her for the next 81 seconds. Descending from her observation post with the deadly silence that had earned her the nickname the Ghost, Sarah emerged from the house like an avenging angel. Her grandfather's rifle was trained on Morrison's center mass, and her voice carried the kind of absolute authority that had commanded respect in combat zones across Afghanistan. "Drop everything and get off my property, now." Morrison turned slowly, his predatory grin widening as he took in the sight of Sarah standing alone with her rifle. "Well, well," he said, his voice thick with anticipation. "The little soldier girl finally shows herself." He made no move to comply with her orders. Instead, he nodded to his men, who began spreading out to flank her position with practiced coordination. "We've been watching you for weeks, sweetheart," Morrison continued, his tone becoming increasingly intimate and threatening. "We know you live alone. We know your routines. We know Deputy Rodriguez can't get here for 40 minutes on a good day. And now we know you're even prettier up close than you looked through our binoculars." Sarah's training told her to fire immediately, to eliminate the primary threat before his crew could complete their flanking maneuver. But some part of her, the part raised by a grandfather who believed in giving every person a chance to choose between good and evil, held back one final time. "Last warning," she said, her rifle rock steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Leave now, or face the consequences." Morrison's laugh was the sound of pure evil given voice. "Consequences? Lady, you have no idea what consequences look like, but you're about to learn." He gestured to his crew, and Sarah realized with crystal clarity that her moment of mercy had been interpreted as weakness. The attack came from her blind spot, just as Morrison had planned. Santos had used their conversation to circle behind the barn, his ranger training allowing him to move through the darkness like a ghost himself. The impact when he tackled her from behind drove the air from her lungs and sent her rifle skittering across the frozen ground. As Morrison's massive hands closed around her grandfather's weapon, the symbol of her family's honor and her last line of defense, Sarah realized that her 3 weeks of preparation, her military training, and her tactical advantages had all been neutralized by a single moment of human decency. Morrison stood over her with her own rifle pointed at her head, his crew closing in like vultures sensing death. "Now the real fun begins," he whispered, and Sarah understood that the war for Martinez Ranch had just taken a turn she might not survive. The cold Montana ground felt like ice against Sarah's cheek as Santos pressed her face into the frozen earth, his knee grinding into her spine with the weight of a man who'd learned to subdue prisoners in the mountains of Afghanistan. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was being held down by techniques she'd probably taught to other soldiers during her years as a combat instructor. Every breath sent clouds of vapor into the frigid night air, and she could taste blood where her lip had split against a rock during the tackle. Morrison stood over her like a conquering general, her grandfather's rifle cradled in his massive arms with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. The weapon looked different in his hand, smaller, somehow diminished by his brutal intent. Where her grandfather had used it to feed his family, and Sarah had carried it to protect her land, Morrison held it as an instrument of terror and control. "You know what I love about bitches like you?" Morrison's voice carried the lazy confidence of a predator who believed his prey was helpless. He walked in a slow circle around her prone form, savoring each word like fine wine. "All that military training, all those medals on the wall, all that tough girl attitude. And here you are face down in the dirt, like every other victim we've had." Tony, the Snake Reeves, emerged from the house, carrying a duffel bag full of stolen property, his gold teeth gleaming in the moonlight as he grinned at Sarah's predicament. "Jake, you should see what this bitch has in there. Military gear, cash, jewelry, electronics. This is going to be our biggest score yet." He dropped the bag with a heavy thud that represented the destruction of everything Sarah's family had built over 3 generations. Miguel Santos shifted his weight, grinding his knee deeper into Sarah's back. "She's got security cameras all over this place," he reported in the clipped tones of a military briefing. "Professional setup, motion sensors, night vision equipment. This wasn't some helpless rancher lady. She was ready for war." Morrison laughed, the sound echoing across the ranch like the howl of a satisfied wolf. "Ready for war, but not ready for warriors. That's the difference between playing soldier and being soldier, sweetness. You've been playing house with daddy's guns while we've been living in the real world." Danny Kruger hung back near their vehicle, his nervous energy radiating discomfort with the situation's direction. At 22, he was the crew's newest member, recruited from a meth lab bust where his desperation to avoid prison had made him willing to do anything Morrison demanded. But this holding down a woman on her own property while his partners planned unspeakable acts wasn't what he'd signed up for when he agreed to join their crew. "Jake, maybe we should just take the stuff and go," Danny ventured, his voice cracking with tension. "We got what we came for. No need to complicate things." Morrison's head snapped toward the younger man with predatory focus. "Complicate things? Boy, you think robbing houses is our only business? You think that's why we spend weeks watching each target, learning their routines, studying their weaknesses?" His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than screaming. "We're in the fear business, Danny. Fear is what keeps people from fighting back, from calling the cops, from testifying in court. And this bitch," he gestured toward Sarah with her own rifle, "needs to learn what fear feels like." Sarah's military training had taught her to assess every tactical situation, even when that situation seemed hopeless. Santos weighed approximately 190 pounds and had positioned his center of gravity directly over her torso, making it nearly impossible to throw him off through leverage alone. Morrison stood 8 feet away, too far to reach, before he could bring the rifle to bear, and his position gave him clear sight lines to any escape route she might attempt. Tony the Snake occupied the middle ground between the house and the tree line, cutting off her potential retreat toward the woods where she might find cover. Danny remained by their vehicle, a modified pickup truck with reinforced bumpers and tinted windows, clearly their mobile command center and escape route. But as Sarah calculated distances and analyzed weaknesses, she also listened to the conversation flowing around her. These men weren't just thieves or even simple murderers. They were psychological terrorists who fed on the suffering they created, who had turned brutality into a business model that had allowed them to operate across 3 states without being caught. The Wyoming couple thought they were tough too, Morrison continued, his voice taking on the reminiscent tone of someone recalling a favorite memory. Big, strong rancher, military veteran just like you. Thought his service meant something. Thought he could protect his pretty little wife. Morrison chuckled, the sound devoid of any human warmth. By the time we were finished with them, he was begging us to kill him rather than make him watch what we did to her. Sarah's blood turned to liquid nitrogen as she realized the full scope of what these monsters had planned for her. The psychological torture, the violation, the eventual murder, it was all part of their established pattern, refined through multiple victims across multiple states. Deputy Rodriguez had tried to warn her, but even his grim briefing hadn't captured the pure evil she was facing. Morrison knelt beside her, bringing the rifle barrel to rest against her temple. The metal was cold against her skin, but not as cold as the void where his soul should have been. Here's how this works, sweetheart. We're going to have ourselves a party that lasts all night long. Each of my boys is going to take his turn with you while the others watch, and you're going to do exactly what we tell you to do. If you cooperate, we might let you live long enough to clean up the mess before we put you out of your misery. Santos leaned down to whisper in her ear, his breath hot against her neck. And if you don't cooperate, we'll make it last for days instead of hours. We'll keep you alive just long enough to understand that every breath you take belongs to us. The weight of their intentions settled over Sarah like a funeral shroud. These weren't men making threats in the heat of the moment. They were professionals who had perfected their technique through practice on other victims, other families, other lives destroyed for their entertainment. But as Morrison stood up and began issuing orders to his crew, Sarah's tactical mind shifted into a different mode entirely. The woman who had hesitated to shoot an armed intruder was gone, replaced by the Marine Corps' instructor who had taught soldiers how to kill efficiently and without remorse. The Sarah Martinez who had hoped for mercy and redemption had died the moment Morrison revealed his true intentions. What remained was something far more dangerous than her captors could imagine. A highly trained killer who had just been given every possible justification for unleashing 8 years of combat expertise on targets who deserved no mercy whatsoever. Morrison thought he had disarmed her by taking away her rifle. He had no idea that the most dangerous weapon on Martinez Ranch had never needed bullets to kill, and it was currently calculating exactly how to reduce 4 predators to broken meat in the shortest possible time. The countdown to their destruction had already begun. Time crystallized into something Sarah could almost touch, each heartbeat stretching into eternity as her mind shifted into the combat mode that had kept her alive through 97 missions in Afghanistan. The weight of Santos pressing down on her back, the cold bite of Montana air against her face, the distant sound of Morrison's voice, everything became hyper-real, processed through the tactical computer that 8 years of Marine Corps training had built inside her skull. Morrison's boots crunched on the frozen ground as he paced around her prone form, savoring what he believed was his moment of absolute control. Santos, get her up. Let's move this party inside where it's warm and we have more room to work. His voice carried the casual authority of someone who had never encountered real resistance, never faced a situation where his physical dominance and psychological warfare tactics had failed him. Sarah felt Santos shift his weight, preparing to haul her to her feet, and in that microsecond of movement, her tactical awareness exploded into perfect clarity. Morrison stood 12 feet away, her grandfather's rifle held loosely in his right hand, barrel pointed toward the ground. Classic mistake that would cost him precious seconds if he needed to bring the weapon to bear. Tony the Snake was positioned 16 feet to her left, distracted by counting stolen cash from her emergency fund. Danny Kruger remained 23 feet away by their truck, his nervous energy making him fidget with his sidearm in its holster. Most importantly, Santos was directly above her in the most vulnerable position possible for someone trying to control a trained combatant. His knee pressed into her lower back, his hands gripping her shoulders, his center of gravity committed to keeping her pinned down. He had made the fatal error of treating her like a civilian victim rather than a military-trained weapon system. Temporarily offline, Sarah's instructor at Quantico had been a grizzled gunny sergeant named Marcus Iron Mike Thompson, who had survived 3 wars and killed more men with his bare hands than most soldiers managed with rifles. His voice echoed in her memory with crystal clarity. Martinez, when you find yourself outnumbered and outgunned, you got exactly one advantage. They expect you to fight like a victim. Don't give them what they expect. Give them hell instead. Morrison gestured impatiently toward the house. Let's get moving. I want her secured in the bedroom before we start having our fun. Santos, bring her along nice and easy. If she struggles, break something that'll make her scream, but won't kill her yet. Santos shifted his grip to Sarah's upper arms, beginning to lift her from the ground, and Sarah felt the tactical window opening like a door to salvation. In approximately 81 seconds, Morrison's crew would have her inside the house where the vault's confined space would limit her mobility and multiple escape routes would be cut off. After that, their numerical advantage and weapon superiority would make resistance nearly impossible. But for the next 81 seconds, they were vulnerable. Sarah's breathing slowed to the controlled rhythm she'd learned in sniper school. Each inhalation, feeding oxygen to muscles that were about to perform feats of violence her captors couldn't imagine. Her heart rate dropped from panicked civilian to focused predator as adrenaline mixed with tactical precision in her bloodstream. Morrison had made his first critical error by treating her rifle as a trophy rather than keeping it ready for immediate use. Santos had made his second error by assuming close physical contact would give him control rather than vulnerability. Tony was about to make his third error by remaining distracted when he should have been watching for counterattack. Danny's error was being there at all his nervous energy and moral discomfort had already marked him as the weak link in their formation. Sarah's mind cataloged their positioning with mathematical precision. Santos would be her first target, the immediate threat who had to be neutralized before she could address the others. His military training made him dangerous, but it also made him predictable. Army Rangers learned to control prisoners through leverage and pressure points, techniques that worked perfectly against untrained civilians, but left them exposed to someone who knew exactly how to counter those same techniques. Morrison would be our second target, despite his possession of the rifle. His overconfidence and psychological need to dominate would slow his tactical response. Giving her the fraction of a second, she needed to close distance before he could bring the weapon into play. Tony the Snake represented pure street violence, brutal but undisciplined, the kind of opponent her instructors had taught her to handle through superior technique and focused aggression. Danny would be last, assuming he didn't simply run when the shooting started. His youth and inexperience made him unpredictable, but his obvious discomfort with the situation suggested he might freeze rather than fight when violence exploded around him. "Please," Sarah whispered, injecting just enough tremor into her voice to sell the performance. "Please don't hurt me. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't hurt me." Morrison's predatory grin widened with satisfaction. "That's more like it, sweetheart. A little cooperation goes a long way toward keeping you breathing." He gestured toward Santos with the rifle barrel. "Get her moving. I want to see what she looks like when she's properly motivated." Santos's grip on her arms loosened slightly as he prepared to lift her to her feet, and Sarah felt the moment of perfect tactical opportunity crystallizing around her like winter air. Every muscle in her body coiled with potential energy. Every nerve ending focused on the explosive sequence of movements that would transform her from victim to executioner in less than 3 seconds. Her grandfather's voice joined the chorus of tactical instruction echoing in her mind. "Mia, a Martinez never surrenders to evil. When the devil comes to your door, you send him back to hell with interest." Morrison thought he had broken her spirit by taking away her rifle. Santos believed his superior size and position gave him unbreakable control. Tony assumed his reputation for violence would keep her compliant. Danny hoped his hesitation to participate fully would somehow absolve him of what was about to happen. They were all about to learn that assumptions could be fatal when directed at someone who had spent 8 years learning to kill with surgical precision. The woman they had underestimated as a helpless victim was actually the human equivalent of a landmine, harmless until triggered, then devastatingly lethal to everything in the blast radius. Sarah's countdown began with mechanical precision. 81 seconds until they reached the house and her tactical options vanished. 80 seconds until Morrison's crew completed their transformation of her from threat to victim. 79 seconds until the point of no return. But they wouldn't need 79 seconds. In fact, they wouldn't need more than 10. The ghost was about to teach them why some legends are born in blood. Time. 81 seconds remaining. Sarah's body transformed from victim to weapon in a microsecond of explosive violence that shattered the frozen Montana night. Her right elbow drove backward with the force of a sledgehammer, connecting with Santos's solar plexus with surgical precision. The sound was wet and hollow, the unmistakable crack of ribs breaking under impact. Santos's grip on her arms vanished as his diaphragm spasmed, robbing his lungs of oxygen and sending him staggering backward with a strangled gasp. Time. 78 seconds remaining. Before Santos could recover, Sarah rolled left and swept her leg in a vicious arc that connected with his ankles. The former Army Ranger crashed to the frozen ground with bone-jarring force, his head striking a fence post with a sound like a melon hitting concrete. Blood began pooling beneath his skull as his body went limp, his military training neutralized by 8 years of Marine Corps combat instruction applied with lethal precision. Time. 74 seconds remaining. Morrison fumbled for control of the rifle, his overconfidence transforming into panic as he realized his prize victim had just destroyed his most capable subordinate in less than 4 seconds. "What the fuck?" he began, but Sarah was already moving with the fluid grace of a predator who had found her prey. She covered the 12 feet between them in a heartbeat, her body low and compact, presenting minimal target profile while closing distance at inhuman speed. Morrison managed to raise the rifle halfway before Sarah's left hand chopped down on his wrists with bone-breaking force. The crack of fracturing bones echoed across the ranch as her grandfather's weapon tumbled away into darkness. Time. 71 seconds remaining. Morrison's roar of pain and rage filled the night air as he swung his massive right fist toward Sarah's head. In Afghanistan, she had faced Taliban fighters hopped up on adrenaline and religious fury, men who fought with the desperate strength of the damned. Morrison was bigger, but he lacked their fanatical focus. Sarah ducked under his haymaker and drove her knee upward with devastating precision, connecting with his kidney at the exact angle her instructors had taught her would cause maximum internal damage. Morrison doubled over, his face contorted in agony as Sarah's knee strike sent shockwaves through his internal organs. Before he could recover, her elbow descended like a hammer onto the base of his skull, dropping the 250-pound criminal leader like a sack of concrete. Time. 68 seconds remaining. Tony the Snake Reeves had been counting stolen money when enough. Violence exploded around him, his street-honed survival instincts screening danger a fraction too late. He spun toward the sound of combat, his hand reaching for the pistol tucked in his waistband, his gold teeth bared in a snarl of desperate aggression. Sarah saw his movement and calculated trajectory, distance, and timing with the mechanical precision of a computer designed for warfare. Tony's gun was clearing leather when she launched herself through the air in a flying side kick that would have made her martial arts instructors weep with pride. Her boot connected with Tony's chest with the force of a cannonball, lifting his 180-pound frame completely off the ground. The pistol spun away into darkness as Tony crashed into the porch steps with bone-crushing impact. Wood splintered under his weight as his ribs caved inward, puncturing his left lung and sending bloody foam cascading from his mouth. Time, 64 seconds remaining. Danny Kruger stood frozen by the truck, his young mind struggling to process the carnage unfolding before his eyes. 3 hardened criminals men who had terrorized victims across multiple states had been reduced to broken meat in 17 seconds by a woman who moved like death incarnate. Please. Danny's voice cracked with terror as Sarah turned her attention toward him, her dark eyes reflecting moonlight like a wolf's. I didn't want to be here. They made me come. I never hurt nobody. Sarah advanced on him with the relentless pace of an executioner approaching the gallows. Danny's hand shook as he tried to draw his weapon, but fear had turned his fingers to rubber. The pistol caught in his holster as Sarah closed the distance between them with predatory patience. Time, 60 seconds remaining. I got kids. Danny sobbed, still struggling with his gun. I got a baby girl at home. Please don't kill me. Sarah's tactical mind processed his words with clinical detachment. Danny Kruger, age 22, arrested twice for methamphetamine possession, once for domestic violence against his girlfriend. The baby girl at home was likely true men like Danny, often used children as shields when facing consequences for their actions. But Sarah had seen the terror in other victims' eyes, had read the reports of families destroyed by Morrison's crew. Danny's presence here, regardless of his reluctance, made him complicit in rape and murder. His tears might be genuine, but they came too late to wash away the blood on his hands. Time, 57 seconds remaining. Danny finally freed his weapon, bringing it up with shaking hands toward Sarah's center mass. For a split second, the barrel wavered in the space between them, representing the difference between life and death for both combatants. Sarah moved like liquid lightning, her left hand deflecting the gun's barrel skyward while her right fist drove into Danny's throat with surgical precision. The pistol discharged harmlessly into the Montana sky as Danny's windpipe collapsed under her strike. He dropped to his knees, clutching his throat and making desperate gurgling sounds as his oxygen supply was cut off. Time, 54 seconds remaining. Sarah stepped back and surveyed the battlefield that had been her grandfather's ranch yard. 4 grown men lay scattered across the frozen ground like broken dolls, their reign of terror ended by 27 seconds of precision. Violence. Morrison groaned weakly, blood streaming from his skull fracture. Santos remained motionless, his breathing shallow and irregular. Tony the Snake coughed up blood and bone fragments from his shattered ribs. Danny writhed on the ground, his face turning blue as his damaged throat struggled to draw breath. Time, 50 seconds remaining. Rex emerged from his hiding spot in the barn, a German shepherd's military training having kept him concealed until the threat was neutralized. He approached each fallen criminal with professional assessment, his nose cataloging their sense for future identification. His tail wagged once the signal he'd been taught to give when a mission was successfully completed. Sarah retrieved her grandfather's rifle from where Morrison had dropped it, checking the weapon for damage with practiced efficiency. The stock bore a small scratch where it had struck the frozen ground, but otherwise, the family heirloom remained intact. She worked the action once, chambering a fresh round and ensuring the weapon was ready for immediate use if any of her attackers attempted to continue their resistance. Time: 45 seconds remaining. Morrison stirred weakly, his hand reaching toward a backup pistol concealed in his ankle holster. Sarah's boot stamped down on his wrist with crushing force, pinning his arm to the ground while she relieved him of the weapon. "Stay down," she commanded, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had just demonstrated her willingness and ability to kill without hesitation. Time: 40 seconds remaining. One by one, Sarah zip-tied each attacker with wrench supplies, their own equipment bags, providing additional restraints to ensure they remained immobilized until law enforcement arrived. Her movements were efficient and professional, shrieking the criminals like the dangerous animals they had proven themselves to be. Time: 30 seconds remaining. Sarah pulled out her satellite phone, military-grade equipment that worked even in the remotest areas of Montana, and dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, her voice was calm and steady, betraying none of the adrenaline that had fueled her combat performance. "This is Sarah Martinez, at the Martinez Ranch on Highway 287. I have 4 armed intruders down and secured. Send ambulances and law enforcement immediately. Suspects are injured but stable. Time: 0 seconds remaining." The war for Martinez Ranch was over. Deputy Tom Rodriguez had seen 37 crime scenes during his 20-year career in Montana law enforcement, but nothing had prepared him for what awaited him at the Martinez Ranch. The GPS coordinates Sarah had provided led him down the familiar gravel road at 2:43 a.m., his patrol car's headlights cutting through the darkness to illuminate a scene that would haunt his dreams for years to come. 4 ambulances were already on scene, their red and blue lights painting the ranch yard in colors that reminded Rodriguez of a battlefield. Paramedics moved between the fallen criminals with professional efficiency, but their hushed conversations and grim expressions told the story before Rodriguez even stepped out of his vehicle. These weren't routine assault victims. These were men who had been systematically destroyed by someone who understood exactly how to inflict maximum damage without crossing the line into murder. Sarah Martinez sat on her porch steps like a queen, surveying her conquered kingdom, her grandfather's rifle resting across her knees and a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tactical ponytail, and despite having just engaged in lethal combat with 4 armed criminals, she appeared completely calm. Rex lay at her feet, the German shepherd's alert posture indicating he was still in protective mode despite the obvious neutralization of all threats. "Jesus Christ, Sarah," Rodriguez whispered as he approached, his trained eye cataloging the devastation. "What happened here?" Sarah took a deliberate sip of her coffee before answering, her voice carrying the same steady tone she'd used during her 911 call. "They came to rob me, Tom. Had other plans too, based on their conversation. I changed their minds about both." Her matter-of-fact delivery belied the complexity of emotions churning beneath her calm exterior relief, satisfaction, and a cold satisfaction that justice had been served with surgical precision. Morrison lay 20 feet away, his massive frame reduced to a broken heap of moaning flesh. The paramedics had stabilized his fractured skull and internal injuries, but his left kidney would require emergency surgery and months of recovery. His hands were zip-tied behind his back, despite his injuries, and Rodriguez noted with professional appreciation that Sarah had taken no chances with securing her prisoners. Miguel Santos required the most immediate medical attention, his breathing shallow and irregular from the head trauma Sarah had inflicted with her elbow strike. The paramedics worked frantically to stabilize his condition for transport, their urgent voices carrying across the ranch yard as they coordinated his evacuation to the trauma center in Billings. His military training had made him the most dangerous member of Morrison's crew, and Sarah had neutralized that advantage with ruthless efficiency. Tony the Snake Reeves presented a study in calculated destruction. His chest cavity had been restructured by Sarah's flying kick, 3 ribs driven inward to puncture his lung and create internal bleeding that would have been fatal without immediate medical intervention. Gold dental work lay scattered in the eye, frozen dirt around his unconscious form, a glittering testament to the precision of Sarah's knee strike. The paramedics had intubated him to maintain his airway, but his prognosis remained uncertain. Danny Kruger sat propped against the truck wheel, his youthful face a mask of terror and pain as an MTI worked to assess the damage to his throat. Sarah's strike had been precisely calibrated severe enough to incapacitate him immediately, but controlled enough to avoid permanent damage to his vocal cords or breathing passages. His eyes tracked Sarah's every movement with the desperate attention of prey watching a predator, clearly understanding how close he had come to joining his unconscious companions in a more permanent state. "Sarah, I need you to walk me through exactly what happened," Rodriguez said, pulling out his notebook with hands that weren't quite steady. "FBI is already en route from Denver, along with the state crime scene unit. This is going to be a federal case, given these guys' track record across multiple states." Sarah nodded, her tactical mind already organizing the sequence of events into a coherent briefing. "I was monitoring the perimeter when my motion sensors detected 4 individuals approaching the house. At approximately 11:47 p.m., I observed them through night vision equipment for several minutes, confirming they were armed and appeared to be conducting a coordinated assault on my property." As she spoke, Rodriguez noticed the professional terminology and precise timeline that marked Sarah's military background. This wasn't an emotional victim recounting a traumatic experience. This was a combat veteran providing an after-action report with the same clinical detachment she'd probably used in Afghanistan. "They breached my front door and began ransacking the interior while I maintained overwatch from an elevated position. When they began destroying family property and discussing their intentions regarding sexual assault, I attempted to confront them with verbal commands to leave the premises." Rodriguez's pen froze above his notebook as the full implications of Sarah's words sank in. "They were planning to rape you?" Sarah's eyes hardened to obsidian chips. Morrison was very explicit about their intentions. He described in detail what they had done to previous victims, including the couple in Wyoming 3 weeks ago. They believed disarming me had eliminated any threat I might pose. Her voice carried a cold satisfaction that made Rodriguez's spine tingle. They were incorrect in that assessment. The sound of rotor blades announced the arrival of the medical helicopter that would transport Santos to the trauma center. Rodriguez watched the flight crew load the unconscious criminal into their aircraft, noting the restraints that remained secured even as they fought to save his life. Standard procedure when dealing with suspects who remained dangerous despite their injuries. The physical altercation lasted approximately 27 seconds. Sarah continued, her clinical tone never wavering. "I neutralized each threat in order of immediate danger, using minimum necessary force to ensure they could not continue their assault. All suspects were secured and medical assistance was requested as soon as the tactical situation was stable." Agent Patricia Wong of the FBI arrived as Sarah finished her initial statement, the federal investigator's sharp eyes immediately cataloging the scene with professional interest. Wong had been tracking Morrison's crew for 8 months across 3 states, building a case that connected them to 17 separate incidents, including 6 murders, multiple sexual assaults, and property crimes totaling over $2 million in losses. "Ms. Martinez," Agent Wong said as she approached, her voice carrying genuine respect. "I'm Agent Wong with the FBI. I've been hunting these animals for the better part of a year. What you did tonight," she gestured toward the broken criminals being loaded into ambulances, "probably saved dozens of lives, maybe hundreds." Sarah stood as the agent approached, her military bearing evident despite the traumatic events of the evening. "They made their intentions clear, Agent Wong." I responded accordingly. Wong pulled out a thick file folder filled with crime scene photographs and victim statements. Morrison's crew was responsible for the murder of Robert and Diana Chun in Wyoming 3 weeks ago. Before that, they killed a retired couple in Colorado and assaulted 2 women in Utah. Their pattern was escalating: more violence, longer periods of torture, increasingly bold attacks. The agent's voice grew heavy as she continued. "We found detailed surveillance photographs of you in their vehicle, along with plans of your property and notes about your daily routines. They'd been watching you for weeks, planning this attack with military precision. If you hadn't stopped them tonight, they would have moved on to other victims after they finished with you." As the last ambulance pulled away into the darkness, Sarah reflected on the strange mathematics of violence. In 27 seconds, she had ended a reign of terror that had consumed multiple lives and destroyed families across several states. 4 predators who had believed themselves apex hunters had discovered they were prey when confronted by someone with superior training, stronger motivation, and absolutely nothing left to lose. The war for Martinez Ranch was over, but the legend of what happened on that frozen Montana night was just beginning. 6 months after the 81-second war that transformed Sarah Martinez from isolated rancher into living legend, the world had changed in ways she never could have imagined. The security camera footage from that frozen February night had been viewed over 15 million times across multiple platforms, despite Sarah's initial reluctance to release it. The FBI had requested permission to use the recording as a training video for their tactical response teams, calling it the most decisive single-handed neutralization of multiple armed suspects in modern law enforcement history. But fame was a double-edged sword that cut both ways. While Sarah appreciated the recognition her actions had received from military and law enforcement communities worldwide, the constant stream of media requests, book deals, and movie offers felt like another kind of invasion. She had defended her grandfather's ranch from criminals, not to become a celebrity. The woman who had earned the nickname The Ghost for her ability to disappear in hostile territory now found herself thrust unwillingly into the spotlight. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in August. Sarah was repairing fence line damaged by spring flooding when her satellite phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number she didn't recognize. "Ms. Martinez? My name is Jennifer Hawkins. I'm calling from Lubbock, Texas." The voice was young, probably mid-20s, with a tremor of barely controlled fear. "My husband deployed to Syria 3 months ago, and I'm living alone on our ranch with my 2 little girls. I've been following your story, and I was wondering, could you teach me what you know about protecting myself and my family?" Sarah set down her fence pliers and gave the caller her full attention. "What's your situation, Jennifer?" "We've had some incidents," Jennifer continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "Trucks driving by slowly at night, tools missing. From our barn, tire tracks where there shouldn't be any. The sheriff's department is overwhelmed, and my nearest neighbor is 8 miles away. I keep thinking about what happened to you, and I know if something similar happened here." Her voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. That conversation led to another, then another. Within 2 weeks, Sarah had received calls from women in Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, and Colorado, all of them living alone on remote properties, all of them dealing with suspicious activity that local law enforcement couldn't adequately address. These women had read about Sarah's story and recognized something in her experience that resonated with their own fears and vulnerabilities. Sarah made a decision that would transform not just her own life, but the lives of hundreds of women across the American West. She would share what she knew, pass on the skills that had saved her life, and ensure that other families would never suffer the fate Morrison's crew had planned for her. The first ghost training weekend took place at Martinez Ranch in September. 7 women made the journey from across 3 states, ranging in age from 24 to 62. They were teachers, nurses, ranch hands, small business owners, and military wives, ordinary women facing extraordinary circumstances who had decided to take responsibility for their own protection. Sarah had initially planned to focus on basic self-defense and situational awareness, but she quickly realized her students needed something more comprehensive. These women weren't just looking for a few martial arts techniques. They wanted to transform themselves from potential victims into capable protectors of their families and property. The training curriculum that evolved over the following months became legendary in its own right. Students learned tactical shooting with various weapon systems, hand-to-hand combat techniques adapted from Marine Corps training, perimeter security, and surveillance detection, and most importantly, the psychological preparation necessary to use violence effectively when facing a lethal threat. But Sarah's most valuable lesson wasn't technical, it was psychological. Ladies, she would tell each new group as they gathered in her grandfather's barn for their first session, the most important weapon you can carry isn't made of steel or lead. It's the absolute refusal to be a victim. When evil comes to your door, you have 2 choices: submit or fight. I'm here to teach you how to fight and win. The program grew beyond Sarah's wildest expectations. Word spread through rural communities like wildfire, carried by women who had been transformed by their training experience. Local newspapers picked up the story, then regional magazines, then national media outlets. Sarah found herself featured on the cover of magazines ranging from American Rifleman to Women's Health. But she remained focused on the mission rather than the publicity. Jennifer Hawkins became Sarah's first success story. 3 months after completing her ghost training weekend, Jennifer used the skills Sarah had taught her to defend her home from 2 armed intruders who had been stalking her family. The confrontation lasted less than 30 seconds and ended with both attackers hospitalized and Jennifer's daughters safely protected. The local sheriff called Jennifer's response textbook perfect and credited Sarah's training program with preventing what could have been a tragedy similar to the Martinez Ranch incident. As autumn turned to winter, Sarah established the Ghost Ranch Training Institute as a formal nonprofit organization dedicated to rural women's self-defense education. Corporate sponsors began supporting the program, recognizing both its social value and the positive publicity that came from association with Sarah's story. Major firearms manufacturers donated equipment, tactical gear companies provided training materials, and even Hollywood celebrities began quietly funding scholarships for women who couldn't afford the training fees. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. On a cold December morning, almost exactly 1 year after the night that changed everything, Sarah received a certified letter from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Inside was a commendation signed by the director himself, officially recognizing her actions as having prevented immeasurable future harm to American citizens and demonstrated the highest ideals of civilian courage in the face of deadly threats. More important than the federal recognition was the letter that accompanied it from Agent Patricia Wong, who had become a friend during the lengthy investigation and trial proceedings. Sarah, Wong wrote, I wanted you to know that Morrison died in federal prison last week. Lung complications from his injuries never fully healed, and he spent his final months as helpless as the victims he terrorized. Santos is serving life without parole, Tony will be in a wheelchair for the rest of his sentence. And Danny testified against the organization that supplied them with targets. The network that enabled their crimes has been completely dismantled. Your 81 seconds of courage ended a reign of terror that could have continued for years. Standing on her porch on the anniversary of that life-changing night, Sarah reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. Her grandfather's ranch had become a pilgrimage site for women seeking empowerment and self-reliance. The local community had embraced the economic benefits of hosting the training programs, and the town of Martinez Creek had been revitalized by the constant stream of visitors. Rex, now graying around the muzzle, but still alert as ever, lay at her feet watching. The latest group of students practiced tactical formations in the yard below. These women, a kindergarten teacher from Colorado, a nurse from Wyoming, a veterinarian from North Dakota, and a young mother from Utah, were learning to be their own heroes under the same Montana sky where Sarah had made her stand against evil. The sign by her gate still read Martinez Ranch, but everyone called it Ghost Ranch now. It was a place where ordinary women learned to do extraordinary things, where fear was transformed into confidence, and where the legend of one woman's refusal to be a victim had inspired a movement that was changing lives across the American West. Sarah's grandfather had always taught her that true strength wasn't measured by the ability to avoid conflict, but by the willingness to stand and fight when fighting was the only option. As she watched her students practice the skills that might someday save their lives, Sarah knew that his legacy and hers would endure long after the last echo of that 81-second war had faded into Montana history. The ghost had found her true calling, and it was beautiful.